And welcome to another week of People, Power, and Politics. This is your one-stop shop for unbiased political news, where we fact-check both parties, both candidates, unapologetically. I'm Roop Raj. 42, can you believe that? That's how many days the candidates have to make their case to you before polls open on November 5th. And there's a lot happening in the world of politics tonight on this Monday, so let's go. The road to November running fast and furious, yes, right through Michigan. And we know of at least 2 days this week where candidates will be in our state. Who's coming and where they'll be in just a second here. Plus, a political cartoon widely condemned as racist has us picking up the conversation about decency in politics as we get through this emotionally charged election year. We're talking about what needs to be done to turn the temperature down and the possible fallout from this cartoon. That's all coming up. But we start with these 4 words: shutdown averted for now. The Republican-controlled House passes a short-term spending bill, avoiding a government shutdown that would have been triggered October 1st. And when we say short-term, we mean short-term. It only funds the government until December, but it does include an extra $231 million to bolster the Secret Service after those 2 assassination attempts against former President Trump. The reason for the struggle? House Speaker Mike Johnson had tied the spending bill to another measure, which would require proof of citizenship when registering to vote. That's despite the fact it's already a felony for non-citizens to register to vote. And studies show non-citizen voting is extremely rare. All right, this is a serious political bill, but we have to touch on Taylor Swift here, specifically her endorsement of Vice President Harris. Polling company Resonate Data estimates there are more than 2 million Swifties who could be influenced by the pop star's endorsement. 230,000 of them live in Michigan. Epic MRA pollster says this endorsement could decide the race, especially if it gets undecided voters to the polls. Take a listen.
They're more likely to vote because of the Taylor Swift endorsement and encouragement. And she has just such a tremendous following. With the number of social media contacts she has, if she just communicates a few more times between now and the election, I think she is getting support from them much more than anything that Joe Biden got in terms of support.
Well, the data company also suggests the Swifties most likely to follow her lead are between the ages of 22 and 37, and they are women. As the campaign heats up, former President Trump and his running mate, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance, will both be in Michigan this week. Vance will be up north on Wednesday, speaking in Traverse City. The campaign's website builds this visit around the auto industry and manufacturing. And then on Friday, Trump himself will be in our state, making 2 campaign stops. He'll be in West Michigan at 2 o'clock that afternoon, speaking at a manufacturing facility in Walker, that's just north of Grand Rapids. Then he'll hold a town hall at Macomb Community College at 6 p.m. That's going to be in Warren. Now to the investigation into the second assassination attempt of former President Trump. Prosecutors released a disturbing letter allegedly written by the suspect. They say Ryan Ruth wrote this letter months earlier describing the assassination attempt, even offering a bounty on Trump's life. The 58-year-old was arrested after authorities saw a rifle barrel poking out of the shrubs while the former president was golfing at Mar-a-Lago. He faces federal gun charges, Ruth does. Prosecutors say cell phone records show he stalked Trump for at least 30 days. Now to another story that had a lot of you talking over the weekend. A controversial political cartoon published by conservative magazine National Review involving Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. It followed the deadly attacks in Lebanon after pagers used by the militant group Hezbollah exploded, the attacks hurting hundreds of people. Now, this is the cartoon created by Henry Payne. You're looking at it right now, who also happens to be a Detroit News auto columnist. But it was not published in the Detroit News. More on that in a minute. But to be clear, it did not appear in the Detroit News at all. But it shows Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib with a pager that had exploded on her desk. Tlaib responded to the cartoon on X, saying it'll incite more hate and violence against Arab and Muslim communities. We reached out to the National Review, but we have not heard back. But we did get this from the Detroit News. I want to make this really clear. The Detroit News did not publish this cartoon, nor did we have any role in its creation or in its dissemination. We have access to that syndicate, but chose not to run this cartoon because we found it lacking in sensitivity to those killed and injured. That, according to the editor, Gary Mellis of the Detroit News. This is just the latest example of the political temperature getting even hotter in our society, especially right now during this election year. And many on both sides of the aisle have said we need to tone it down. But like everything, it starts with us. So we asked you how you keep the temperature down when you're having a political discussion. Here's what many of you had to say to us.
Actually have no confrontations with politics talking about it, because I'm kind of leeway both ways. It's like your opinion is yours and mine is mine.
I will allow them to express their opinion about their political position, and depending on what they say gives me an indication if I could give a little pushback or not. But my goal is not to argue. My goal is not to change their mind.
The best way that I know to avoid any sort of conflict around politics is I don't talk to people when we're going to disagree.
You have to simply see a person as a soul and not as the human vessel, because we all have a soul inside of us that keeps us alive, and no matter what we wear, what we think, who we're voting for, that doesn't change that we have a heartbeat and we have lungs that breathe air.
If you have a Carville situation at your house right now and the person who's sitting on the couch next to you doesn't agree with you politically, just look straight at the TV. Just look right at me. Ignore the person on the couch. We also asked you the question on fox2detroit.com. How confident are you that the political temperature can actually be turned down? If you want to vote, all you have to do is scan that QR code right there at the bottom right of your screen. So far, the vast majority of you say you're not at all confident that this temperature can be turned down just yet. Well, now back to this. It's a cartoon that's been widely condemned as racist, especially among the Arab American community, but among many other people as well. State Representative Abraham Aash is joining us via Skype tonight. Representative, thank you for your time here today.
Thank you for having me, Roop.
What was your reaction when you first saw that ad, that political caricature hit Twitter and hit all these other social media platforms?
Couple things. I think it was incredibly disturbing that you had someone who's a local Detroiter who probably interfaces with many Arab Americans thinking that this type of cartoon would be okay. But also the danger that it presents, because if you normalize this type of language and quote unquote comedy and messaging around the dehumanization of Arab and Muslim politicians, it could lead to violence, something that we would regret seeing, and certainly something that, regardless if you agree or disagree with somebody, no one should be subject to harm and violence simply because you have a different political perspective than they do.
You know, it's an interesting conversation about sensitivity and where a line lies. We should be clear that no one is saying you should agree with everybody and that you should have, you know, all amicable conversations about politics or our geopolitical world that we live in right now. You're saying there is a line, and there's a line that everybody, especially people who are in the media, should observe, right?
Absolutely. You know, anything that can induce violence, anything that suggests there is a politician in the United States that has an allegiance to a terrorist group or is associated with any group like that is just unacceptable, because what it does is it will inspire someone by looking at the cartoon that you're seeing in front of you of saying, hey, this person, not only do I disagree with them, but they are someone that is disloyal to this country, and therefore they are worthy of violence. They're worthy of some sort of attack. And that's just simply unacceptable. You know, as I always say, dangerous dialogue leads to dangerous deeds.
And I know you've made it very clear what you think about this particular, piece that was published. I want you to have an opportunity to directly speak to the person who put this together, who's local, who's right here in town, and also to the National Review about their discretion when it came to actually putting this out. What do you have to say to them?
I'm disappointed, and I really hope that they recognize that there's impact with what we normalize in terms of language and behavior against our public officials. There is no excuse to suggest that someone you disagree with is somehow inherently violent and therefore would lead to them to get attacked in a violent manner. And whether you have, again, any agreement or disagreement with a particular local or state or federal public official does not excuse rhetoric, a culture that suggests we can normalize a type of hateful and xenophobic culture that would then lead to violence, which we have seen here in our own state against our governor.
Yeah, we certainly can do better in having conversations that are more civil and more decent. In the meantime, I do want to ask you, while I have you as a prominent Arab American leader in our community, right now, when you look at the temperature in terms of that which people are looking at with the conflict in Gaza and where Kamala Harris stands on that and where Trump stands on that, is it safe to say there are a large number of uncommitted voters who will be ready to come out again and perhaps vote uncommitted?
I think there are still over 40 days left before this election, Roop, and there's a lot that can be done to earn the votes of folks. But I think we need to see a commitment to peace and a long-term solution towards a ceasefire, ending the violence, and ensuring that there's long-term stability in the Middle East. And unfortunately, the current president, President Biden, although he's done so many incredible things domestically, the foreign policy has demonstrated to be an abject failure and is disheartening. But there is time for our politicians, particularly Vice President Harris, to show the people of Michigan that she can be trusted to lead this world towards peace. What I will say, though, is Donald Trump is absolutely going to cause more death and destruction across the world because of his reckless leadership, and he's not to be trusted back into the White House.
Representative Abraham Aash, we appreciate your time and, of course, your opinion here on this show. We thank you for being with us. Come back and talk to us again sometime.
Thank you, Rube.
Our conversation about bringing decency back to politics and tough conversations about the Middle East continues right after the break. You're watching The Pulse on Fox 2. Back now on The Pulse, keeping this very important conversation going about how to bring decency back to politics as though it's left. Oh, it's left the building a long time ago. It's something that's come up once again after that political cartoon, widely condemned as a racist attack against Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib. I'm joined now by Karen Dumas with the No BS News Hour and Troy Mayer, a Republican, Ethan Baker. Good to see both of you. Thanks for joining us here.
Thank you, Root.
Let's begin with this cartoon. Political cartoons are as old as this country and this republic is. But when you have moments like that pop up, what was the first thing that went through your mind, Karen?
Well, I mean, that's a very sensitive issue. That's a very sensitive topic. It's something that is very divisive. And so people found their sides, and so they found something with it. I'm sure if you dug through Henry's repertoire in the past, you find a lot of things that somebody could be offended by, but it is political satire.
At what point do you look at the line and you say this is offensive? Because most political satire, by virtue of it being satire, is going to be offensive at some point, but this is perhaps not the right time and certainly not the right place.
Well, timing matters, but I mean, in all fairness, everything is offensive to somebody. I mean, it is, and intent and interpretation don't always align, you know, whether it's something satirical or whether it's just general conversation. So I think the timing, you know, it's a very sensitive issue, rightfully so, and maybe it was just poor judgment in terms of placement at the time.
Mayor Ethan Baker, in one of your prior lives in politics, you worked for President Reagan after he left office. You helped close his presidential library. You worked with a man who, in many ways and senses, kind of defined decency. If he was to see something like this, you can't speak for him, but that brand of politics from the 80s and 90s, early in that end, what would they say about that?
Well, I think there were some really, really horrible satirical political cartoons against President Reagan, against Tip O'Neill, I mean, Walter Mondale, all of the big figures back then. So I'm not so sure that he would be so offended by what was done to Congresswoman Tlaib. You know, and I find myself, I'm not usually defending the Congresswoman. We're different political parties, and she's said some very incendiary things herself and done a lot of things that have offended a lot of people. But, you know, it is a little tough to have a sitting member of Congress be called a terrorist, essentially, by that ad. And I question whether it was really appropriate. But on the flip side, good satire gets people talking about it, and here we are talking about it. So apparently, from a pure political satire standpoint, it's doing a good job.
And as we pointed out earlier, the Detroit News here at home, you know, caught eyes with that and said, hey, we're not touching that. We're not putting that in our newspaper because so many people, of course, who live here are Arab American. And by the way, we shouldn't assume that someone who's not Arab American wouldn't be offended by this either. But there is such a large number of Arab American voters. And I wanted to kind of talk about that for a moment. The temperature of this particular campaign when it comes to claims of xenophobia on one side, and now we have so many people calling on Kamala Harris to do more when it comes to standing up for Palestine and Gaza. Where do you think we're headed with this conversation?
Well, I think people are afraid, too, to also take a stand. I mean, because they want to try to appeal to the greater masses. And out of fear of not doing so, they just are more reserved than they should be as opposed to taking a stand. You saw what the mayor of Dearborn just endorsed Trump. So, you know, I mean, it's I don't know where politics is going these days. It's not like it used to be, and unfortunately, it's more divisive than it's ever been before. But I would wish people would stand up for what they believe in, even if people disagree with it.
Did that surprise you to hear about the mayor of Dearborn endorsing Donald Trump?
It was Mayor of Hamtramck.
Hamtramck.
It wasn't Mayor.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Hamtramck.
I apologize.
Just before
Right. Thank you.
Mayor of Dearborn gives you a call.
I know.
Yeah.
But no, surprised? No, I'm not surprised based on what's been happening in Hamtramck. But I think it's a good attention getter. It's certainly something I'm not getting involved in the presidential race from an endorsement standpoint. I think it affects the way I can do my job as mayor. I'm not sure it really is going to move any vote. Well, I take that back. In that Arab community, it may very well move some voters in Hamtramck to vote for President Trump, which, you know, in that case, I guess good for him. But it's a little bit interesting. You talk about taking a stand and how people are viewing this issue, especially this is such a sensitive issue, and it's not a black and white issue. And, you know, there's no bigger supporter of Israel than President Trump, and yet to have, you know, people who are Muslim and Arab supporting the president maybe is a little bit questionable. And yet I ran into a very dear Muslim friend of mine in Troy, and I was talking to her about the election, and, you know, she said, well, I'm not voting for either of them. I'm voting for Jill Stein. I think they're both bad, right? And, you know, that also, those third-party votes, that's going to make a huge impact on this race in Michigan and other states as well. So, you know, it's one issue of many, but for some it is the issue, I suppose.
And so again, just to clarify again, the mayor of Hamtramck endorsing Donald Trump.
I'm sorry.
No, that's something that's very important to point out. But the bottom line is you're talking about something that is a surprise to many people. Talk about the temperature for a moment. We'll start with you, Karen. If we look at where we're at relative to November 5th and now, do things get any better when it comes to the political temperature, or does it just continue to spiral in many people's regards out of control?
I think it's going to continue to spiral because it has worked. Spiraling has worked for both candidates up to this point. And unfortunately, I think it depends on who you ask and from what pool you are testing to determine the temperature of this campaign. And I think, like the mayor said here, people have forgotten that there are third-party candidates. There are other options. And the undecided voters are the ones that continue to weigh in the middle. Harris's supporters are going to continue to be Harris supporters regardless. Trump supporters are going to continue to be Trump supporters. But you've got that core in the middle that's going to decide, and I think it's going to be close either way.
How big do you think that squishy middle is?
I think it's larger than we think. And, you know, I saw Sam Robinson from the Free Press post on Twitter today that there was a Trump sign at a house on East Grand Boulevard in Jefferson in the heart of Detroit. So, you know, certainly political yard signs don't vote, but, you know, it's anybody's election. I don't think either side should take it for granted.
It's interesting because both of you, as I've known both of you for many years, are friends of people who don't agree politically. And I feel like that's one of the reasons I like to have the two of you on the show is because, Karen, you've talked about that. You're friends with people who you're diametrically opposed to politically, but you're very close to. How is that something that you've managed to do? Because
unless somebody is, I mean, like I said, kind of jokingly, but seriously, unless they're a member of the KKK, your political alignment doesn't always make you a bad person. We see things differently. We live differently, you know, we love differently, and I think that we have to respect those differences. And, you know, if someone is a supporter of someone that I don't necessarily endorse or agree with, I have to give you that freedom and flexibility. It doesn't make you a bad person. You see things differently than we do, and I have to respect that.
And you, Mayor, you've had to respect that and also work with people as the mayor of the city of Troy in a pretty diverse place where, let's not forget, the Tea Party, you know, came through Troy quite a bit, you know, many years ago. And so the root of so much of that is there, but you have to look at people in the eye and say, how do we work together? How have you managed to do that? Well, it's why I won't endorse in the presidential race, and I stay out of the partisan endorsements because it affects how I do my job as mayor, as a nonpartisan mayor by charter. People are people. We may disagree on who we vote for, or, you know, a lot of different things. But, you know, if I'm sitting with Karen and I'm learning about Karen and figuring out things about her, I'm going to like her for who she is, not who she's voting for. And that ultimately is what should drive people in their friendships and relationships. And people come to their voting beliefs very, for the most part, genuinely. Something happened inside them at some point, and you can't change who they are. You can't just write them off because they're making a decision every 4 years. We only have about 30 seconds left, but I'm going to ask you a simple question, but one that I'm really curious about. Do you think there's the majority of people in this region think more like you than what we see on X and Facebook? Do you believe that people are actually more willing to look at their neighbors even when they think differently? Or is this something that we're getting wrong here?
Well, I think people are in their hearts, but I think people like being a part of something, and so there's always the the mob mentality and the piling on. So if someone is doing or being critical, it's like, oh, I want to be critical too because I don't want to be left out.
Sure.
They don't want to stand. They don't want to say what they think or what they feel for fear of criticism or being ostracized.
People always want to vote for a winner, and so if they feel that their group is winning, they're going to vote with that group. I mean, it's a sad fact of politics that's been going on for hundreds of years.
Or say they're going to vote.
Or say they're going to vote for that. We don't know what's going to happen, but it absolutely is I think there's good people who want to think about things and really feel it, but there's also people who just want to be part of a group. And that's life.
It's not up to the politicians and the media alone to bring the temperature down. It's up to each and every one of you when you go out for coffee or you run into someone that you don't agree with. And so we thank you for beginning, I hope, that conversation in earnest that continues at home. Mayor Ethan Baker, Karen Dumas, good to see both of you. Thank you.
You too,
Rip.
Still ahead tonight, we'll get you caught up with some stories you might have missed this weekend, including a surprising announcement by former President Donald Trump. Next. It's People, Power, and Politics. It is The Pulse on Fox 2. Thanks for staying up with us tonight. Even though this show takes the weekend off, politics never does. But whether you were spending it watching football or hitting up a cider mill, we have you covered with all of the political stories that happened over the weekend. So in case you missed it, former President Donald Trump holding a rally in North Carolina without one of his allies from the state. We're talking about Mark Robinson, the state's lieutenant governor, who's running for the top job there. He's been in hot water since CNN reported he allegedly made several inflammatory comments on a porn website's message board, including referring to himself as a, quote, black Nazi, end quote. The comments were posted between 2008 and 2012. Robinson denies he made the post, but several of his senior campaign staffers have quit their posts. The lieutenant governor made this fiery statement today.
You folks want to focus on tabloid trash, and quite frankly, I am sick of it. And every time I get in front of you, I'm going to cut you off and tell you, you need to refocus yourself on the issues that matter to people. And 15-year-old sensational lies don't matter to people.
You've got to listen to what people say and what they don't say. Trump did not mention Robinson during his speech on Saturday. That speech went a little more than an hour. A lot of focus was on the government spending bill the U.S. House passed, but there was another vote you might have missed as we head into the weekend. The Republican-led House passed a bill that would have rolled back the Environmental Protection Agency's tailpipe emission limits. They say it would force Americans to buy cars they can't afford and don't want. You hear Republicans during the campaign calling it an EV mandate, but it wouldn't force the sale of EVs, not a mandate. It says the auto industry could meet the mandates if 56% of car sales are electric by 2032, also putting in new requirements for hybrids and gas-powered cars. Now, even if the rollback bill passes the Senate, it'll likely be vetoed by President Biden. And finally tonight, former President Trump making some news this weekend for something he said outside of a rally. There's been a lot of talk, a lot of discussion about his age throughout the campaign, especially when President Biden was still in the race. In an interview with reporter Cheryl Atkinson over the weekend, the 78-year-old said if he loses this year, the election would be his last.
If you're not successful this time, do you see yourself running again in 4 years?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I think that will be it. I don't see that at all. I think that hopefully we're going to be successful.
Now, Trump would be 82 years old in 2028, a year older than President Biden is now. And with that, my friends, now you're all caught up. That is The Pulse for tonight. Battleground with SC Cup is next. I'm Roop Raj. We'll see you tomorrow.